complete that. Thank you. So without further ado, welcome to Graham Russell, who's the Chief Executive of the Office of Product Safety and Standards. And our session today, thinking about outcomes and being able to demonstrate the outcomes delivered by services is really important when we're trying to articulate the value of the service that you provide. Graham's going to focus the session today on thinking about building those outcome-focused services. So without further ado, thank you very much, Graham.
Well, thank you, Catherine, and thanks to everyone for coming along today. With the way of these hybrid things, my session falls in the middle of the 3-day event rather than the beginning or the end, but I think that's partly to fit in with diaries, so I appreciate the opportunity. But this is also my chance to welcome people to this event as a whole. As Catherine said, different people will have connected with different sessions. I have to admit this is my first session, so already I'm in trouble with the chair, but I'm glad to be here today and to be able to talk to you. And I think it's a great opportunity to do a number of things before I get into what Catherine's asked me to talk about. First of all, to say thank you to Catherine and the team, not just for this event, but also for what I think is now 10 years of work in this area, helping local authorities think about their wider outcomes, thinking about the contribution they make across what matters to people locally. And that's really what this session is about, but it's actually what the whole 10-year programme is about. And in that sense, I think my thanks to them, and also my thanks to you for being part of this and for all the work that you've done in your teams and in your local authority areas, not just in that period, but beyond that. There's always change afoot and there's always new priorities, but I think it's important that we maintain this effort and focus, and we'll be looking at new ways of doing that as we go forward, the same as you will, I'm sure. So thank you for coming along this afternoon. Thank you for being part of this. I am going to talk about a particular topic, which is building outcome focused services, which I hope is relevant to many of us. It matters as much for me as the Chief Executive of the Office of Product Safety and Standards, thinking about what our outcomes are, as I'm sure it does to those in local authorities and elsewhere. Just looking at the poll, it looks like most people are in some form of local authority service. So I guess and hope that what we say can be relevant to that. So I think we've got some slides to look at, and I want to try and explain a way of thinking about this question. I am hopeful that we will be able to have opportunity for questions. Please do put them in the chat. As Catherine said, we've only got half an hour, but if I whiz through fairly quickly, then we should have time to pick up some questions, or I can talk about some of the things I cut out from the main presentation if necessary. So I want to think about building outcome focused services. What does that mean and how do we go about it? And whenever I get a hard question like this, and thank you to Catherine for the hard question, whenever I get a hard question like this, I have now a model which I use for framing my thinking. So we'll move straight on to that next slide, please. Some of you will have seen this before, some won't. We call it the regulatory delivery model. And in essence, it's a map for thinking about, well, how does this particular question fit into my wider thinking? And whether that question is building a new service, delivering a service, or in this case, thinking about making sure that we're outcome focused, then this should be a map to help us think about that. And what the model says is there are two domains for thinking about our activity. There's a set which we've called the prerequisites, the things that you have to have in place to build effective regulation, and that's the governance framework, the accountability and the culture of the organisation. And we can share with you some more slides on this, I'm sure, which include KPIs under each of those to help us think through what are the issues in having an effective governance framework, etc. But those three things are necessary to have in place before you can even begin to be an effective regulator. And so we would always want to start a conversation there. And then having thought about those three things, there are then three practices, which are outcome measurement, risk-based prioritisation and intervention choices. And they are doing the right things, and they are the things that we think about day in, day out when we're leading services, running services, being part of services. So with your permission, what I'd like to do in the next 10-15 minutes is just think a little bit about what each of those things mean and how we think it through from the perspective of this idea of building outcome focused services. So I only have one clever bit in this presentation, but it comes now, Nicole, with a bit of luck. Let's see if this works. Let's push that to one side. Ooh. I always worry about animations on Teams. They're not always. Oh no, there we go. Slide that away, and slide the practices away. And let's think about the way that we approach this. So let's make a start. One more click might do it. There we are. Let's start with thinking about one of those practices, which is the practice of outcome measurement. And as I say, along with all the other 6 elements, there are KPIs and some guidance on this, both in a book that we've put together, but also in some guidance that we can send out, I'm sure, as part of this conversation. And we think about outcome focus and particularly outcome measurement for a number of reasons. I think one is that it's very easy to get distracted, and it's very easy, particularly for anyone who's doing regulation, to get distracted. And that happens in all sorts of ways. One is that we often focus on things that are not outcomes. There might be inputs, there might be outputs, things that we can measure easily, things that we can point to, things that perhaps people tend to value. And that might be the number of staff we have, the budget we have, the number of complaints we get, the number of inspections we do, how quickly we respond to complaints, all sorts of things of that nature. And we tend to focus on those, and we're often encouraged to focus on those, but they're not in themselves outcomes. And they can be a distraction from thinking about the outcomes that really matter. And it's often a discussion that people have about, should we measure process or should we measure outcomes? And I used to think it was very simple. We should obviously measure outcomes, but you know, the more people you talk to, there is value in measuring process, making sure you've got control of the process. Some people will be very keen to say, well, you can only do what you can do, and the result of that is in the hands of other people. So there is a genuine challenge against outcome measurement. And I'm not saying those things don't matter, but actually measuring outcomes is fundamental to ensuring the value of what we do. And the reason I say that is that, particularly for us as regulators, regulation is not an end in itself. Regulation is for a purpose. It's one of the things that government has within its toolkit to achieve societal outcomes. And the challenge I would put before any of us is, what was the point of the regulation that you're seeking to enforce, or the regulations that you're seeking to enforce? And whenever you're focusing on the regulations, whether that's compliance, inspection, prosecution, whatever it might be, you've got to ensure that you're actually thinking about the outcome that the regulation was there for. So once upon a time, whatever regulation you've got in your mind at this point, once upon a time that regulation didn't exist, and somebody thought it ought to exist because there was a societal problem, whether that was unsafe food, unsafe working practices, noise, misdescribed products, dangerous buildings, lack of fire safety in buildings, whatever it was, somewhere along the line, there was a view that that outcome, that policy problem, was not being addressed. And so the outcome of the activity should be to go back to that policy outcome, that intention, and ensure that it is being addressed. And that's not just a national perspective on it, that's also a local perspective on it. And when we talk to local elected members, same as when I talk to MPs and ministers, what they're concerned about is, are people being kept safe? Are people being protected? Are people eating safe food? Are buildings safe? Is there a limit on environmental nuisance and damage and all those things, rather than have the XYZ regulations of 19 whatever been delivered in full? And so if we focus on the process, we miss the point. The other great thing about measuring outcomes is that we don't just have one outcome. We don't just exist to enforce the law, but we also exist to drive other outcomes as well. And as the audience that are here today, interested in primary authority, interested in better business for all, you might say, I don't really need to say that, because by definition, those are activities that look at more than one outcome. Better business for all looks at the way that regulation can be delivered to protect people, but also to build local economic prosperity and ensure that businesses can thrive. So I'm probably preaching to the choir here by saying there's more than one outcome. But I'm thinking, from my perspective, we're very interested, and ministers are very interested at the moment, in what we're doing about innovation. Now, does that mean we should encourage innovation and stop worrying about protection? Or does it mean we've got to find ways of encouraging innovation whilst also protecting people? And so concepts like sandboxes and regulatory innovation, horizon scanning, all these different areas that we get involved in, all need to be done within the context of those other outcomes. And so outcomes is beneficial because it enables us to look across the piece. And again, that's challenging. Some people would find that challenging. Why are you doing that? Why don't you stick to your knitting? Surely you've got one job to do, which is to protect people. Everything else is for other people to do. And I would always want to challenge that and say that as regulators, there's always more than one way to deliver our principal outcome. And that when you're choosing which way to deliver that outcome, thinking about the other outcomes that you care about is really critical. And my simple example there, which you'll have heard more than once, I'm sure, is that if a premise is selling unsafe food, you can guarantee to stop that premise selling unsafe food if you close it down. You've delivered one of your regulatory outcomes, you've stopped the supply of unsafe food. But actually, if you've also got other outcomes to think about, whether that's local economic prosperity, local environmental well-being, local health well-being, healthy choices, then you might want that shop to stay in business, but to sell safe food. So working with them might be for those wider outcomes, just as much as ensuring that the unsafe food is not sold. And of course, you can take that example and apply it across the wide range of not just local authority regulation, but all other areas of regulation. So for me, it's really important that we focus on outcomes, and more than focus on them, it's important that we measure those outcomes. I remember many years ago when I was working as frontline officer and I started thinking about some of these things. I got responsibility for our data returns in the authority I was working in, and I started talking to people about some of these things. And someone used a phrase that has stuck with me ever since. And he said, "We value what we measure, and we measure what we value." Now, you might say we shouldn't. You might say we should value all sorts of things. But the truth is that what we measure is what we tend to value. So if we're not measuring our outcomes, the implication is that we're not valuing our outcomes. And if we're not valuing our outcomes, then we're probably not measuring them. Now, there's all sorts of reasons why that's tricky. And we won't go into all that here, but we have worked with local authority colleagues on some really good tools through the Impact and Outcome Toolkit for how you measure your outcomes and how you take people with you on that journey towards measurement. But fundamentally, if you don't measure it, then you don't value it. And if you don't value it, then it will cease to matter. And quite often when I'm talking to local authority colleagues, one of the questions that I'm asked is, why have local authority resources for regulatory services been cut? Why isn't there more budget? Why don't we have more money? And it's always a really good question. And it's a question that's not simple. But part of it is about whether we are engaged in this debate, whether we are not just delivering outcomes that people value, but also measuring them in a way that people can understand and increase the value they put around those outcomes. And if we're not in that debate, if we're not part of that within the local authority context, or in my case, within the cross-government context, then it won't be any surprise if our resources are not being increased or are being decreased, because we're not demonstrating that we are delivering on the things that matter to people. So the whole science and skill of outcome measurement, for me, is right at the heart of this. And we have to be bold in addressing this, and we have to, certainly for the purposes of this conversation, if we're interested in building outcome-focused services, then we have to put it top and centre of what we do. And that means when we're thinking about our business planning, when we're thinking about our recruitment, when we're thinking about our planning of activity, it should all be around the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And I know from my experience that when we have a major incident or a major activity, we'll spend a lot of time thinking about what we're going to do, and we'll think about the law and what the law allows us to do and who can do it and who's got the capacity and how we build partnerships. But we always want to take ourselves back to what is the outcome that we're looking for? What will good look like? And how will we know if we've got there? And those two simple questions are questions that are useful having in almost every meeting. What will good look like? And how will we know when we've got there? And if we can't answer those questions, if we have no definition of good, if we don't know what the outcome we're striving for is, then it will be no surprise if we get drawn down other alleys and distracted and have difficulties that flow from that. So those two questions for me sit right at the heart of that. I'm going to put that top and centre of my thinking and my use of the regulatory delivery model for building an outcome-based service, and I would encourage you to put that top and centre in your thinking. If you want to be outcome focused, if you want to be outcome based, then what are the outcomes that matter? What are the outcomes that matter to you as a service, to your officers, but also what are the outcomes that matter to elected members, to other parts of the authority, and specifically to the people that you serve, the people, whether they're consumers, workers, members of society, whatever it might be. What are the outcomes that they're looking for, and how will they know if they have that? And I think that's top and centre for me. And it's the beginning and end of designing our regulatory activity. But there are two things that sit underneath that, and I'll have those two next, if I may, Nicole. And they are, should slide in beautifully if it's still working. One is around intervention choices, and the second one is about risk-based prioritisation. And these two activity sets sit under outcome measurement as being the principal means that we then deliver those outcomes. And intervention choices is about, as a service, as a regulator, having that full range of tools available to me. If I want to deliver a wide range of outcomes, then I need a wide range of tools, and I need to be able to deploy them. Often we have tools that point towards one outcome or one process, but actually tools that point towards a wider range are often the more sophisticated ones. And I've already mentioned examples of that, ways in which to deliver multiple outcomes, the supply of safe food, but also the existence of good choices, reduction in food miles, enabling of healthy options, local employment, then we'll need interventions other than simply closing a premise down. We'll need the interventions of working with a business, understanding their motivation, assessing their capacity to supply safe food, helping them to make steps in their processes, their employment, their training, their monitoring, and to assess whether that is working in terms of them changing their behaviours. Now, those things are, I would suggest, more complex intervention choices than some of the ones that perhaps point towards a narrow range of outcomes. But actually, it's critical that if we're going to be outcome focused as a service, then we have a good range, a wide range of intervention choices. And that means that we have competent, confident officers who can deploy that wide range of activities. And sometimes we talk about some of these choices as being more difficult. I know that civil sanctions through the Enterprise Act are sometimes seen as more difficult to deploy than notices, prosecutions, and perhaps more traditional methods. But actually they point towards that ability to move towards a wider set of outcomes. And then risk-based prioritisation is the ability to determine what you're going to do. Intervention choices talks about how you'll do it, but what risk-based prioritisation talks about what you're going to do and how you'll know whether what you're doing is the things that are going to make a difference. And really this is about the confidence and the skill to assess very different priorities using a common language, a current currency of risk. And really risk is, in that sense, the way that we make those comparisons. And if you like, the picture here is that if you're going shopping, you'll use money to make a choice between different options, very, very different, but they all use the same currency, they all use money in that sense. Well, it's the same with regulatory activity. There's very different options of what you might do. Do you look at this area or do you look at that area? And you'll know within your areas what those choices are. But how do you compare them? How do you know whether it's better to put your resource into this sector or that sector? Well, the answer is risk. And confidence in measuring risk and confidence in using risk is really important here. And at this point, I'd love to flag something that we in OPSS are very close to publishing, which we've been working on for quite a while, and with some of you testing our thinking, testing our ideas. When we left the European Union, we also left behind various databases and systems, one of which in the product regulation area is called RAPEX, and there's similar things in food assessment and so on. And we needed to replace that with our own database. We did that, but we also wanted to replace it with a better methodology for risk assessment. And I'm hoping that as we deploy this, that many of you will see that it works more widely than just for non-food products. And I'm hoping that you'll be able to make it work in your area, because to me, having confidence in the way that we measure risk is going to be absolutely critical for the future. So risk-based prioritisation, enabling us to put our resources where they're going to make the most difference, and particularly in the context of this presentation, which are the areas that are most likely to deliver on the outcomes that we've decided we care about. And how will we know Whether we've achieved them, well, in one sense, changes in the risk assessment will be one of the indicators of whether we are achieving our outcomes. So risk ought to reduce when we use the right intervention choices to deliver on those outcomes, and asking ourselves that tough question. Sometimes we think it's very good to have lots of high risks, but actually as a regulator we ought to be mitigating those risks and seeing those risks come down as behaviour changes and as we achieve those outcomes. So are we brave enough to say this is our risk profile today, and we will do the same assessment? And so again, coming back to an example from OPSS, one of the things we've just put in place now is a wide range of samples. So generally speaking, when we take samples, or when we work with local authorities on sampling and test purchasing, it tends to be risk-based. It tends to be, let's look at the areas of highest risk or the areas of highest hazard. But we've just put in place what I'm calling a shopping basket approach, where we look at a set of products that are not risk-based but are more based on consumer behaviour, so that we can measure over a period of time, and obviously it will take a while before we have a track record on this and before we can show trends, but over a period of time to start to see whether we are succeeding in reducing the risk across those different areas. And I'm looking forward to that being a major piece of our work on how we measure the outcome of our activity as a national regulator, obviously working with local authorities on product safety, but also on construction products, metrology and hallmarking that are our areas. So that's the triangle, if I may be so bold, as of thinking about outcome measurement, supported by intervention choices, supported by risk-based prioritisation. And then the other three aspects of the regulatory delivery model, which, Nicole, we can put in along the bottom, are then supportive in terms of having the right local authority environment, the right regulatory environment, national regulator in my case. So have we got a governance framework that will enable us to make those broad range of intervention choices? Is the legislation sufficiently broad? Can we use it in ways that are broad? Have we got support from, whether it's MPs, ministers, in my case elected members, in local authorities case, have we got their support for the way we want to do things, particularly if we're proposing a change, then taking those people with us and ensuring that they actually see the benefit in the way that we want to work will be right at the heart of being an outcome focused regulator. And if we haven't got that support, then that's probably where we need to start, because if we start to make the change at the top without the foundation at the bottom, then we may well lose that support that we have. And generally speaking, trading standards, environmental health, fire safety, licensing are very widely supported by elected members, and rightly so, because they make a big difference for people. But if we try and move away from what they regard as perhaps the bread and butter, without building a conversation with them about how we can make a wider impact whilst not neglecting our core function, then it is easy to lose their confidence. So getting that governance framework right, working with people, working with our regulatory legislative environment, working with elected members and others who are responsible for the service, but also thinking about that horizontal network. Who are the other regulators that are working on these same areas? It might be in other geographic places where we can learn from, or it might be in the same place where we'll want to build a partnership. So governance framework speaks to those things. Culture is right at the heart, and deliberately put at the centre of this picture, is right at the heart of who we are as a regulator. It's about our leadership, it's about our values, it's about the competency of our frontline officers. And all of those things really matter. They're not the things you can change in a moment. They're not things that just happen overnight. They are things you have to build over time. How are we building our leadership? How are we building our competency, and what are our values? Catherine's come on the screen to tell me that I've got to wrap up, but I am quite close to wrapping up, and I'm on my last point, Catherine, which is about accountability. And accountability, really, I'm sure you've touched on this elsewhere, is about making sure that the people we deliver the services for are engaged with the services we deliver. So first and foremost, that will be about people, beneficiaries, whether that's consumers, citizens, workers, the environment, householders. There'll be different people for different ones of you. But who are those beneficiaries, and how are they playing into the service you're creating? And then also the businesses that we regulate. How are we accountable to them? How do we ensure that what we do actually enables them to be more likely to comply with the law rather than less likely? So those are the foundation elements: governance, culture, accountability, and onto those we can build those choices. And I hope that when we do those things, we can be better and better at delivering outcomes. As I say, I'm conscious that for this audience, it's something you think about already. So I hope those few thoughts will help you to do that and give you shape for doing that in, and say very happy to share the KPIs and so on that sit behind that. Catherine.
Thank you, Graham. A couple of questions that have come up in the chat, but just before I move on to those, question that had you just picking up on your point about relationship with counsellors. Have you got any suggestions really about how colleagues can reframe the conversation with counsellors to move them away from thinking solely about outputs to thinking about outcomes?
Yes, I think there are some great examples in the work that local authorities have done, and maybe we can just look back through some of that and point people towards those. I think that's where the best examples come from. People will say that my experience is a long time ago, and I suppose it is now. I worked in Staffordshire, but it's 20 odd years ago, 14 years ago, 14 years. But actually, there isn't that much difference to working with MPs. It's still about understanding what they care about and finding a point of connection for the conversation. So I would always start with a question, what are your priorities at the moment? And elected members, in my experience, like to talk about what matters to them, what's coming through their postbag, what is mattering to them locally. And then you need to move the conversation on, because a lot of that might well be things that have nothing to do with you. But gradually you'll start, as you have that conversation, to find areas of common interest. And it will often be the things that perhaps are about place and are about location, are about how people feel. And those are touch points for people, and elected members are very close to those that they represent. So you'll start there, and then as you move through the conversation, perhaps with portfolio holders or committee chairs or whatever it is you have in your structure, they'll tend to look a little bit more widely about the things that matter more generally, and so you can start to build that connection. And then when you go from there to, and we do this, that could help that, in my experience, they're often quite keen to see those connections. And of course, they care that you're doing a good job. They care that you're carrying out an inspection, the Food Standards Agency, and so on and so forth. But what they really care about is, so what? What is that doing for people around here? Can you build that story for me? And that's where the Impacts and Outcomes Toolkit, I think, should help.
So just picking up on the Impacts and Outcomes Toolkit, Steve Allen has posted in the chat there asking how closely we're working with AXO on the Impacts and Outcomes reporting. Because it's been an excellent tool demonstrating trading standards outcomes.
I think that's absolutely right, and my history goes back long enough to when that toolkit was created back in the days when I was running something called LBRO, but increasingly now it's people like AXO who are taking that forward, and rightly so, and trying to change the conversation towards measuring things that matter. And so I would encourage all of you to think about who's doing that in your area, and area of trading standards, obviously AXO, environmental health, CIH, and let's have that conversation about how we do that. And then what does that mean for the national regulator? It means that we need to be playing our part in that. Instead of always measuring things that are very process based, are we measuring the things that arise from that impact and outcomes work? And I think certainly areas of product safety, I think we do that. It's harder in some areas than others, and I think we need to be bold and be making that brave leap, but I think we are doing that.
Yeah, I think sort of John picks up at, you know, the result of the pandemic and changing the ways that we're working in actual physical visits has changed our kind of intelligence. So we need to think again about how we collect some of that information. But I think a great place to end today is with, I think, the quote so far of the week from Helen Atkinson about how we attract people to the professions and making the professions sexy. But the quote that I'm going to take away from that, Helen, is that primary authority scheme is sexy and we need to promote it. But I think there's a serious point there about, we talked about the competency of officers and making sure that we've got services that are full of officers that can deliver, and how we need to promote those services. And I think, Helen, government is aware. We in OPSS are working with other departments to keep pushing that message. But I don't know, Graham, whether you want to finish the session today just picking up that point from Helen.
I see that she's already put in the chat that she agrees with you. It's very difficult for a civil servant to say that something they do is sexy, so I'll leave that for others to make that comment. But I've been involved in primary authority for a long time, as has Catherine. And I do see it as a way of answering a number of the questions that we've raised this morning. And it does address the resource question, but it also addresses the ensuring that what we do has relevance and value for people, which is even more important. And I'm just going to touch, Catherine, if I may, on the challenge that Mark's put down there about So do you do less of something if risk-based prioritization based on intelligence says that it matters less? And I think this is, I mean, the short answer is yes, because if you try and do everything, then in the end you'll do nothing. But also I think these things have got to be dealt with. It's where competency meets risk. What we do know is that if you act on a very simplistic assessment of risk, if no one's complaining it can't be a risk, therefore I won't do it, then what we know is that problem will come around. And it's a slightly somber note to end on, but it's very important to us, and I'm sure to many of people on this call. The events of Grenfell Tower probably demonstrated that if we only measure the things that are in front of us, we won't do some of the things that really matter. And then the consequence of that for people in their lives and livelihoods and communities is massive. So for me, risk is about a really intelligent, professionally led use of data. And some of that data will be in complaints, but some of that data will be in our understanding. Someone said earlier, how do we do that if we're not carrying out inspections? It'll be the synthesis of all those things. And often other people have better data than us. And so how do we get that data? How do we use that data? And then how do we drive our activities? So yes, some great comments in the chat there. And thank you.
Okay, well, let's draw the session to a close there, Graham. So thank you very much for your time today and your thoughts. Thank you to everybody for attending and listening. But it's not, day's not over. We've got at 2 o'clock, we've got a session on tourism and events, and also a parallel session on who are your customers. At 3 o'clock, we've got a session about the hospitality strategy. And then at 4 o'clock, we've got a local authority briefing where we've got speakers from HSE, FSA, OPSS and DEFRA, and you should have all had links to that. So thank you very much. Go off and have some lunch, and we'll see you this afternoon. Thank you.